This is my End Time series by Truth Transistor Radio.
The days will come when the great buildings of the cities shall be thrown down, and there will not be left one stone upon another. Do not allow anyone to lead you astray. There will be those who will come in my name, and they will say, I am he, and they will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. These things must take place, but this will not yet be the end.
Welcome to part two of this end time study series. And today we're going to talk about the signs of the end times. So we're going to look at a lot of passages here. And we're also going to refer back to that chart that I showed last time. And I want to be fair and talk about how the different views might look at these things. So, what I'd like to do now is show you, okay, I'm going to show you this chart again, just as a reminder. So you got, sorry, I've got a bad cough today. It's just a dry cough. So you got the tribulation here, the millennium here, and then the little season where Satan is released and another global deception occurs, and then the eternal, the final judgment here before the eternal conclusion, right? And just a reminder of the views. So you have the futurist pre-mill views, which believes that the Great Tribulation is yet future, and that Christ will come during this period of the Great Tribulation, followed by a millennium where Christ and the resurrected saints and the raptured saints reign and rule on the earth for 1,000 years or a long time, followed by another rebellion, global deception and rebellion, and then the final judgment. And then the Amill and post-mill believe that this Great Tribulation was in the first century. We're going to talk about that a little bit, followed by the church age. So they look at this as the church age, and it's just a long time, not 1,000 years. So in their future, they still have this to worry about. Now, if you're an Amill person, you might think that you could speculate that we're already here, because there's a lot of deception going on in the world today, followed by the final judgment. If you're post-mill, you believe things will get better, that the church will continue to bring more people to Christ until the whole world is Christianized. And then, of course, I mentioned the preterist pre-mill view, where Christ actually returned physically in the first century. There was already a resurrection and a rapture, followed by a literal time of where Christ and the resurrected saints reigned and ruled on earth, and that we are in Satan's little season now, which is a view I've only heard for a few years now, and I'm trying to be fair with these things in terms of like not prejudging. And I find them interesting, even if I think they're far-fetched. I find that one to be far-fetched, but I find them interesting, and and it's interesting to think about that we could be actually in the little season now. Okay, what happened to my mouse? There it is. That we could actually be here right now, and all this in the past has been, erased from our history by the deceivers or something. But a lot of that is based upon, I guess, their understanding of the New Testament, and they just take it fully on faith that it happened the way that they understand it. And I'll show you some of these passages. In fact, one of the things I forgot to I have a list of passages here, but I want to make sure I have a specific one. Let me hit plus here and search for it. It's one that says some standing. Okay, let me see where this is. Matthew 16. Okay, I'm going to include that because I want to look at that because that's one of those proof texts for a partial preterist view. So I'm going to include this in here. ESV. And that was verse 28. So I'm going to write this down so that once we start going, Matthew 16, I'll say 24 through 28. We'll get to that one. That'll be the last passage. And we'll look at it from different angles and see what we find. So we're going to start with just reading in Daniel 9, starting in verse 24 through the end of the chapter. And remember, we're looking for signs of the end times. And then we're going to look at that chart when we look at each passage and see how the different views might look at it. Okay, this is Daniel. He was around 500 BC. Let's see if we get any context here of when this was. In the first year of Darius, the son of, by descent of a Mede, who was, at the time of the Medes and the Persians, I guess. So Darius is the king. I don't see any changes here. And then we'll start here in the 70 weeks. Excuse me. The 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Real quick, I just want to talk about this passage. So this sounds like it could be talking about, he's saying that all this stuff is going to happen within the 70 weeks. Now, just to clarify, the 70 weeks here is actually 70 weeks of years, not days. So it's like 70 times 7 of years. So that's 490 years is what most people would say. And I think that that is accurate. And there's a reason for that as we move along. Excuse me. 70 weeks are decree is the decreed about your people and your holy city. I'm assuming that is the Israelites or, Daniel's people, the chosen people in the old covenant. I talked a lot about that in the Once to Die series when talking about the elect and what that means, in my opinion, actually. But and many people's opinion. But anyway, to finish the transgression, that is sin, right? To put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity. I believe that's the first coming of Christ. To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Now, in Leviticus, I don't know if we've talked about this in any of the series I've done, but in Leviticus there is the description of the tabernacle. I think even in Exodus it describes the tabernacle, how you have the entrance, there's a sacrifice at the entrance, there's the you can look it up, but then there's the holy place where only the priests can go into, and then the most holy place, or the let's see, the holy place and the most holy place, I think. Is that what it's called? And only the high priest was able to go in there once a year. In the book of Hebrews, so I'm just kind of quickly, you can look this up yourself, and I'm not sure which chapter it is, but it talks about the tabernacle from the perspective of the new covenant, what it all represents. And that in the old covenant, the priests were the only ones allowed in the holy place, but in book of Hebrews, it says that all believers in Christ are priests. So this is, yeah. So that's what that is all talking about. I'm pretty sure it's talking about coming into the new covenant. That's what it looks like to me in verse 24. Verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, shall be 7 weeks. I'd have to do some research on when Jerusalem was restored. Note it, at this point they are in captivity under the Medes and the Persians, right? And and I know that they build another temple, and it's already up at the time of Christ. So that is historical fact. In fact, let me look up real quick. I'm going to look up when was the second temple built? Second temple, 516 BC. That's interesting. But I'm not saying that that is what this is talking about here in this move. Okay, where was I? But it says going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, which is 49 years. Now, I'm curious if I can look that up. Let's see. When was the going out to rebuild and restore Jerusalem? $458. Okay, let's just look at this. When was the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem issued? This is a somewhat debatable, as there are at least 3 decrees in the book of Ezra. The first is in Ezra 1:1-4. This is a decree of Cyrus that the Jews can go back to Judah and Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This decree is from about 537 BC. There is no mention of building the city and especially of rebuilding the wall, which is almost the definition of a city back then. So this is probably not what the prophecy is a reference to. The second decree is that of Darius in Ezra 6:1-12. We're not going to look at all these passages, but you see it there. You can look it up. This comes from about 518 BC. It is essentially a renewal of Cyrus' decree to rebuild the temple. And for the same reasons as above, this is probably not what the prophecy in Daniel 9 about a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem is referring to. The third decree in Ezra is that of Artaxerxes in Ezra 7:11-28. This decree is actually rebuild the city. The decree comes from the 7th year of Artaxerxes, Ezra 7:8. This is somewhere around 458 BC, from what we know of Artaxerxes. So I'm going to write this down: 458 BC. Okay. From what we know of Artaxerxes' reign from outside sources, this decree actually resulted in the rebuilding of Jerusalem under Nehemiah. Some list a fourth decree based on what is recorded in Nehemiah 1. There is no actual printed decree mentioned here, but we can probably assume that Nehemiah was given some sort of orders, and this could be interpreted as a decree. It is more difficult to date these events. It came in the 20th year, but we are not sure exactly what it is the 20th year of. If it is the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign, then it is around 445 BC or so. So I'm going to go ahead and write that as well, just to have this down. 458 BC to 445 BC, in that era. To me, the most likely thing that the prophecy of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem is a reference to is the decree in Ezra 7:11 through 28, although I will admit that this is somewhat debatable. Ezra 7:11 through 28. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and look this up. I wasn't planning on this, but as I go, I can, I want to be ESV. Okay. I believe it was starting in verse 11. That's not the website I like. Here we go, Bible Gateway. That's what I like. And going back to this is, or where we were, where was it? This was evidenceofchristianity.org. So if you want to look at that, that's where I got that from. I just randomly searched for it, and that's what popped up. 11 through 28. Let's just read this real quick, just to get some context of what we're reading in Daniel, and we'll go back to Daniel 9. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven. Peace, and now I have a decree that anyone of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and also to carry the silver and gold that the king of his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem, with all the silver and gold that you shall find in the whole province of Babylonia, and with the freewill offerings of the people and the priests vowed willingly for the house of their God that is in Jerusalem. With this money, then you shall with all diligence buy bulls, rams, and lambs with their grain offerings and their drink offerings, and you shall offer them on the altar of the house of your God that is in Jerusalem. Just skip down to verse 21. And I, Artaxerxes the king, make a decree to all the treasures of the province beyond the river, whatever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, requires of you. Let it be done with all diligence, up to 100 talents of silver. So Artaxerxes is authorizing this. And that is probably the decree that Daniel was being prophesied or was being told about in a vision. So let's look at this. 7 weeks, 49 years are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression. Okay. Perhaps that has to do with the sacrifices then. Because 49 years is not enough to get to Christ from that point. 70 weeks, sorry, not 7. Then it says, okay, 70 weeks. My fault. Okay. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, so we're saying that's about 458 BC, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, which is 49 years. So 49 years from that which would take us to about excuse me, 409 BC. So what was in 409 BC? Let's excuse me. What does it say? Going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. There shall be 7 weeks. Okay. So I'm curious now. What happened 7 weeks after the restoring of Jerusalem? Now, hopefully it's what I'm looking for. First 7 weeks of Daniel 70, the restoration of Jerusalem. This is from, let's just see what they say. The first 7 weeks of Daniel's 70 weeks. Okay. Prophecy begins 4th day of rebuilding Jerusalem wall until the end of the book of Malachi. Interesting. 455 BC. So 458 is what I had before, but 455 is close enough. To October 30th, Heshvan 10th, 406 BC. Weeks of Daniel. Let's see, who is this? I'm not even sure who this is, if this is reliable. 49 years and 101 days, all 15 events in Daniel, Nehemiah, and Malachi. Interesting. So, okay. I'm not sure where they get that, but okay, let's look at this. Daniel or Nehemiah 6:15. The Jerusalem wall is completed in 52 days. That was 480 years from the date in 26 AD. It's calculated that Jesus walks down to the Jordan. Okay. So that was around 450 something, right? BC. 450 something BC would be 480 years before that. Excuse me. Excuse me. Oh, jeez. Nehemiah 8, 1 through 12. Ezra reads the law from morning to midday. And then Nehemiah 8, 13 through 14, the law of Feast of Tabernacles is discovered. Nehemiah 8, 15 through 18, Israel celebrates Feasts of Tabernacles. Nehemiah 8, 18, a sacred assembly held on 8th day of feast. See, this is all stuff I've never heard before. I was never sure what all this talked about was, you know. The people confess their sin of foreign wives. So a lot of this is in Nehemiah. So Nehemiah would be a good book to study at some point, perhaps to get more context on these weeks of Daniel. Calculated date from history and scripture, the end of the 51-year reign of Artaxerxes. The accurate dating of the end of the reign of Artaxerxes is critical to dating the events at the end of the Babylonian exile and Daniel's 70 weeks. So anyway, you can look at this. It's called thesacredcalendar.com. And I don't know, there might be other views. This is just the first thing I found. Darius the Persian begins reign. So there might be other ideas of this stuff, and I'm honestly not as familiar with all this. Darius the Persian begins to reign. 1222, Levite records records kept during reign Darius and the Persian. Kept during what? It's terrible writing. Anyway, then this is what we're reading now, Daniel 9:25, Daniel 9, and then in Malachi, end of the Old Testament. So they're saying that the 49 years end at the end, the first 7 weeks is where the Old Testament ends. Interesting. Okay, so let's just go back to this. So after the 7 weeks, which is 49 years, then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with square and moat, but in a troubled time. So we know that in history, after the Medes and Persians was the Greeks, and then after the Greeks, the Romans. And so, did it take that whole time, that whole 400 and, let's see, 62 weeks? So 62 times 7 is what? 14, 42, 43, 434 years. Did it take that long to build it? Anyway, we know that there's a temple at the time of Christ. That's the second temple. So it's built by then. I'm curious if it actually took that whole time to rebuild it, or if it started much later than this, as far as the temple being actually, because we saw earlier that the second temple was built in 500 something BC. So, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come. Now, okay, I had a discussion with a post-millennial person, my cousin, post-mill. So let's go back to this. I'm going to remind you this, who believes that this was in the first century after, the generation that Christ was here, and that we're in the millennial period now. So, and I believe this is all future. But if we go back to this phrasing here, and I had a discussion with him because most futurists or pre-mill futurists believe that verse 26 is talking, well, the anointed one that shall be cut off and shall have nothing is Jesus, I'm assuming, here. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so I've always assumed that the prince who is to come, who shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, is, the Romans. That could be talking about 70 AD there, where the temple was destroyed. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. So I can see easily how this could be leading to 70 AD here. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, the post-mill and all-mill believe this was in 70 AD, all this here, verse 27. In fact, going back, this whole thing leads up to 70 AD. Most futurists believe that verse 27 is talking about the future abomination of desolation. I have a thought on this too. I believe that sometimes there's parallel prophecies. I believe that there's been more than one abomination of desolation already, in a sense. I'm trying to think of the king's name, but let's see. Who sacrificed? Oops. A pig in the Jewish temple. Okay. When was this? 168 BC, King Antiochus Epiphanes. That's Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. Invaded Jerusalem and captured the city. He marched into Jerusalem, erected a statue of the Greek god Zeus, and sacrificed a pig on the altar of incense, which is pretty abominable. But that, I don't know of anyone who believes that that is the fulfillment, because Jesus prophesied about it. We'll get to that here in Matthew 24. But that was before Christ came. Then in 70 AD, you had 70 AD abomination of desolation. Because I mean, if I look this up, oops, desolation. Okay. So this is what a lot of the post-mill and all-mill people believe. And you can look this up yourself. And when so I'm not going to read all this, but this is from Mike Rogers, 70ad.com. If we go back to here, what was this? The Wikipedia says, a phrase from Book of Daniel describing the pagan sacrifices with which the 2nd century BC Greek king, so this is pointing to that, replaced the twice daily offering in the Jewish temple, or alternatively, the altar on which such offerings were made. In the 1st century, it was taken up by the authors of the Gospels in the context of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in the year 70, with the Gospel of Mark placing the abomination of desolation into a speech by Jesus concerning the second coming. It is widely accepted that Mark was the primary source used by the authors of the Gospel of Matthew and of Luke for their parallel passages. Giving a description of the Roman armies, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. In all three, it is likely that the author had in mind a futurist, so they're now assuming that event and perhaps the activities of some antichrist. So even in here, it opens it mentions these other two things, but that there could be another one. And just real quick, I just want to point out from my perspective, this could easily be talking about 70 AD based upon the years here. But I always, there is talk about a rebuilding of a temple now, and what might happen then is interesting too. And I believe sometimes there's parallels in prophecies. So just something interesting to consider there. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Now, my cousin believes that that's Christ. It seems odd to me that it's only for 1 week. If Jesus, it seems like it should be an eternal covenant, right? I'm not sure what that 1 week covenant would be. And I think what he described was that it started at his ministry, at the beginning of his ministry, 3.5 years before he went to the cross, and ended 3.5 years later when Stephen was killed. And I'm not sure, but that would put, okay, so I think I've heard Steve Gregg, so look him up. He believes in post-mill or all-mill, one of those. I think he believes that the 1 week is not referring to 70 AD, that is what it leads to, but the 1 week is actually during the ministry of Christ and the 3.5 years after Christ, and it leads to the desolations. So he says that leads to the desolation 40 years later, or whatever, 45 years later. For half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. So that kind of fits with that concept that because when Christ died, the temple, the curtain in the temple was ripped up and there was no need for the Old Testament sacrifice anymore. Right? On the other hand, if you're going to look at 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, so it would have been ended then as well. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate. Now, I would think that that's referring to the Roman armies there. If it's talking about the first century, that's what I would have thought about in the first century, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So, at least I'll be honest, like this could easily have been fulfilled in the first century, all of this. So, I want to just be honest about what I'm reading and not try to squeeze in something that I'm not sure about. There are some reasons why I think that there could be a future abomination of desolation, and it comes from Matthew 24. So now we're going to read Matthew 24. Jesus foretells destruction of the temple, okay, so Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You shall see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat at the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will all these things be?" So that first part is talking about what he just mentioned, the temple being destroyed, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. Now, this part here could be a totally separate thing. A lot of people assume it's all connected, but to me, it's hard for me to I'm trying to think of what they might say about the sign of the coming and the end of the age being in the first. Would that be in the first century? So you could say the end of the age was the end of the age of Jerusalem, ending in 70 AD, perhaps. And sometimes I've heard them say that his coming is not physically coming here, but it's talking about a spiritual coming of judgment on Jerusalem. That's this question here. I think he's going to have a second coming as well. Anyway, let's read what Jesus answers, because I just want to point out that these are not necessarily at the same time. They could be, but not necessarily. They're asking different questions. When will these things be? That is the destruction of the temple. And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And it depends on what you believe his coming is here and what the end of the age is here. My assumption is that these have not happened yet. But the first thing that they asked did happen in the first century. That is the destruction of the temple. But let's keep reading. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray." Now, I think that phrase right there is important no matter what. There's a lot of deception going on today, right? So this is always applicable. Do not let it be led astray. Another version says, "Do not be deceived," or "Do not let anyone deceive you." "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." I guess that was going on in the first century. I know that it's happening now, right? People that claim to be Jesus or the Christ, you've probably seen those cults on TV. "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." Now, wars and rumors of wars seem like it always happens. I will say that in the past century, with media as it is, it's a lot more than it maybe was before, although there was newspapers before that. And before that, I'm sure that even in the first century, there were wars and rumors of wars. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pangs. In the first century, I'm sure, like, what nation is he talking about here? He could be talking about Rome will rise against Israel or Judea, if you're talking about first century. And kingdom against kingdom, there were famines and earthquakes in various places. I don't really know what that was, if that was there in the first century. But again, these are things that happen all the time. Famines happen throughout history, earthquakes throughout history, right? But he just says these are the beginnings of birth pains. Now, one thing I've heard, this is a positive of the futurist pre-mill view, is that since like earthquakes, for example, have been tracked like in the last 50 years, they have exponentially increased in how often and how terrible they are. And same thing with tornadoes and other things. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that's something you can look into if you wish. I saw that somewhere. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. That definitely happened in the first century. It's been happening throughout the church age, though, as well, in different places, not so much in America. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. I think that that's been the case for the most part, not as much in America, although that's happening more now in America too, where the world is hating Christianity. And then many will fall away and betray and one another and hate one another. I know that Jerusalem, or the leaders of Judea, persecuted Christians in the first century. So you could look at that in the first century. There's been persecution throughout history. There has been a bit of a falling away in culture in the West in the past. Actually, it goes back centuries because you had stuff like the Enlightenment period, which is very New Age kind of stuff, and there's been more, I guess you could say, liberal Christianity going on, and it's so we can look at the last 100, 200 years and see this as true. Especially in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of falling away from the faith. I'm not sure what this falling away would have been in that time, because it's not like the Pharisees were ever followers of Jesus. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. We know that in the book of Acts, there are false prophets that are rebuked by the disciples, and so we know that was existing. We know it's happening now. There's quite a few of them on TBN and Christian stations. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. We see that happening now. I'm sure that I'm not sure what that means if you're taking the first century approach, what it means by lawlessness being increased, because the Pharisees were followers of the law. So I don't know what that means, if you're talking about 70 AD there, or if you're talking about that time period. The love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, I want to just point out, the gospel did not reach the whole world if you're taking it literally in the first century, but it did reach the entire Roman world. So that might be how they look at that there. But in the last century, it has basically reached the whole globe at this point. And so that is something to look at on that. So I think in the first century, there is a type of fulfillment in the known world of Rome. So you could look at that and say that is the case. Now the gospel's reached every tribe, tongue, and nation in the entire world. And I'm not sure that it happened in the first century. Um, Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it reached the Native Americans. I don't think it reached the Chinese or whatever they were called at that time. Okay, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, when we go back and look at Daniel 9, it seemed to lead up to 70 AD. So that's a strong case that this could be in 70 AD. And there was an abomination of desolation, I guess you could say, in 70 AD by Domitian, I think. And he was standing in the holy place. And then Jerusalem was sacked. So it was made desolate, I guess you could say. Um, and is it possible this can repeat itself on a global scale to where something similar happens? That is possible. That's kind of what I think. But again, that's just an assumption. I'm not like trying to force that in here. But then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, the only one, I'm guessing that when the abomination of desolation takes place, I don't know if there's warnings like this in the Old Testament. Oh man, got a bad cough today. I don't know if there's a warning like this in the Old Testament. So is it possible that only the followers of Jesus will heed to this warning? Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, the women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, praying that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For there will then, for then, so it seems like then means right after the abomination of desolation, there will be great tribulation, such as have not been from the beginning of the world until now and never will be. So this seems to be talking about the great tribulation. And if this is the first century, then it seems that the great tribulation would have been not necessarily in the 7 years based upon what my cousin told me, but just this period after the destruction of Jerusalem, I guess. Or leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, I guess. I I think it's possible that that was like a local tribulation that was happening at that time, and there could be one that happens on a global scale in the last days, and this could have been the greatest tribulation in that Judea or Jerusalem has ever seen. I don't know. I'm just talking out loud, trying to look at it from both angles here. Such as has not been since the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. This is where we get the concept of the Great Tribulation, right? And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go. Do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there vultures will gather. Immediately after, now this is the part that confuses me from a post-mill, on-mill, or a preterist, partial preterist view. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Real quickly, I want to point out that they believe that the sacking of Jerusalem when they attacked Jerusalem and the abomination of desolation occurred then. But then that's followed by the Great Tribulation. And their explanation of this, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. They say that this is a spiritual event at the judgment and destruction of Jerusalem. So I suppose then that they would say that Jerusalem was sacked, the abomination of desolation takes place, then you have the Great Tribulation, and then Jerusalem is destroyed, I suppose. And that I know that I already know that the answer to this part. When it says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, they believe that symbolic language. If you know about the dream of Joseph in Genesis, where his dream was that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars are bowed down to him. That's his brothers, which all represents Israel, I guess. So they would say this is just the dimming of Israel in a prophetic language. I believe that yes, this could all be symbolic of some spiritual event at that time that could be applied. But I also think that the second coming, this sounds a lot like the second coming to me. There will appear in the sign of the Son of Man. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. And that could be referring to the Romans, I guess. But why would they mourn the destruction of Jerusalem? Maybe they did. And he will send out, let's see, clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call. And that trumpet call will come back again. And they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Personally, I think that sounds like the rapture there. Gather elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And I think that the second coming and the rapture happen immediately after the Great Tribulation. So anyway, I'm trying to look at this from all angles, all at once. Hopefully it's not too confusing. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. And I want to pause there real quick and say that the Post and Allmill would say that proves that it was in their generation. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. My perspective of this is, yes, that could be referring to their generation, but in the previous two verses, it's talking about, at least in verse 33, so also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. And you could apply this to the first century and say, if those are the things that occurred, and then to say that that generation saw him, or you could say that these things have not yet happened, and in the future, when you see all of those things take place, the abomination, desolation, the great tribulation, etc., then you know that he is near. Then it says, heaven and earth will pass away, which did not happen in the first century. But my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be at the coming of the Son of Man. And there's a lot of theories on that I'm not going to get into right now. But we know that man was desperately wicked and thought of evil continually at that time. There's also the concept of the Nephilim and all that. But I'm not going to get into that now. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. I think it's just saying it'll be a surprise to them. It'll come suddenly upon them. Then it's talking about how one will be taken, the other left. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. He gets into some other parables. I'll move on to the next passage for now. But I just wanted to show the different perspectives on this. Okay, Daniel 12 is another good chapter for signs of the end times. The time of the end. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. So that sounds like what we were talking about before. Now, this is 3 chapters removed from the abomination of desolation in Daniel. So I don't know why it's separated just as much, but at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Now I want to look at this real quick because this confused me a little bit. So the books are opened here in the in this part, the final judgment after the millennium. The Great Tribulation is here before the millennium, right? So this confused me a bit because it seems to be saying, but at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. So it seems to be kind of saying that the book, now that could just mean that the first resurrection, happens right after this great tribulation. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, this seems to be talking about the first resurrection, in my view. No, that's the second resurrection, the final judgment. Now, I've thought about this before, like, could it be saying that some to everlasting life is the first resurrection before the millennium, some to shame and everlasting contempt is after, or could this all be after the millennium? So there's many ways you can look at that, because the Post and Amill believe that the first resurrection was spiritual and the second resurrection will be physical, and that will include believers. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. That's an interesting phrase there. I just want to kind of quickly, it's talked about times of trouble, such as the Great Tribulation. By the time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. This to me sounds like it's right after this time of trouble. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. So here it says many, not all. So I assume that could be the first resurrection, although there was people that raised from the dead in the first century. So you could say that's the first resurrection as well. But then it says some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt, which sounds like the final judgment. So real quickly, going back to this chart here, it sounds like it's just sort of quickly talking about this whole timeline without getting into much about the millennium there. So that could be what's going on and why it's confusing, but it could just be summarizing this whole thing without giving much detail. But this sentence here is interesting. But you, Daniel, shut the words and seal the book until, let's see, many shall run to and fro. And if you think about it from a futurist perspective, I always thought this was interesting because in the last 100 years, technology has increased to where people can travel throughout the world, you know, in a day. Not throughout the whole world, but across the world in a day, right? And people are flying back and forth constantly. And knowledge shall increase. And you could talk about science, increasing the last few 100 years exponentially. If you talk about the 1800s, they were closer to, technologically to like the time of Christ than they are to us. Because you think about before, the mid 1800s, around that time, you had the invention of telephones and of cars, airplanes, then fax machines, then you have the internet, and then now you have like AI and weird stuff like that. So it's amazing how much has changed in the last 150 years. And it's changed more in the last 150 years than it did in the previous 3,000 years, So that to me is interesting, and one reason why I think it's that we're close to the last days. We're probably past an hour at this point, but let's look at a few more. This is 2 Thessalonians 2, starting in verse 1. Now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, that sounds to me like the gathering together of the elect and the second coming to me. But we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one deceive you in any way. So that sounds like what Jesus said in Matthew 24 at the beginning of that. For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first. And even Jesus talked about a falling away, right? And the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So that sounds like the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness. I think it was even was it in Matthew 24 where it says lawlessness will increase? Or was that in, well, anyway, we read one where it talks about that. The son of destruction, that could be like the desolation, perhaps, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. This could be the abomination of desolation here. And could that possibly happen again if they build another temple? It could. I think it could. And there was an example of that in 70 AD, but as well as 150 something AD with Antiochus Epiphanes. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And you know what is restraining him now, so that he may be revealed in his time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way. And then the lawlessness will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. So again, a lot of this, if you have a post-millennial view, partial preterist view, I don't know if they would say that the appearance of his coming was 70 AD, or if this is talking about the second coming. So that's one reason why a lot of us believe that that the abomination of desolation is a future event, and this coming of the Lord is the second coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refused to love the truth and so be saved. I would be interested to hear, or that could be also from a post-mill view or the mill view. This could be the when Satan is released after the millennium, uh, that it's talking about there possibly. The false signs and wonders could be after the millennium, although false signs and wonders is associated with the false prophet as well before the millennium. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And real quickly, where is the mouse? There it is. Real quickly, I just wanted to point out that there is a great deception, global deception here. Where are we? Okay, there's a global deception here and here, right? There's a global deception both times. So which one is it referring to here is an interesting thing to consider as well, depending on your perspective here. I believe this is all referring to before the millennium, because you talk, the false signs and wonders is connected to the false prophet, as we will see later when we discuss that. In order that all may be condemned who did not believe. That sounds like the final judgment, though. So that I don't know, maybe who did not believe the truth, but that could be, condemned for the time of judgment, not necessarily at that moment. Okay. I need to get up here now. We've got a few more verses to read. 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 through 5. Now, the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. This sounds like the great falling away again. The hearts of many shall grow cold, or something that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24, and also in 2 Thessalonians that Paul was talking about. Through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Now, I could look at that. If we're talking about the first century, I'm not really sure if they forbid marriage, but I do know that they forbid, they kept the old covenant law on food. And Peter had this vision where he was free to eat more. It could be talking about that. I don't know if they forbid marriage. I know that the Catholics at least forbid marriage for certain people, like the priests and for the nuns, right? This could also be talking about forbidding marriage to fornicate. You know what I mean? Like today, but that's not really forbidding it. It's more like it's like people make fun of marriage now, right? But this sounds like some kind of a religious law. I have heard, I would be interested to see if this could be applicable to the Noahide laws that they're trying to push now. And it's not just in Israel, it's like global. They're trying to push the Noahide laws. That would be an interesting thing to look at. And maybe that's what this is referring to. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and prayer. Okay. couple more here. Oh, come on. 2 Peter 3. This is now the second letter that I'm writing to you, beloved. In both of them, I am stirring up your sincere mind by way of reminder that you should remember the prediction of the holy prophets and the commandment of the Lord and Savior through your apostles. Knowing this first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. I'm assuming when it says that where's the sign of his coming, even post Amil would assume this is the second coming here. On the other hand, I suppose that there could have been scoffers in the first century as well. Excuse me. Or they could be referring to the coming of the judgment on Jerusalem, if that's how some people might understand it there. For they deliberately overlook this fact that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by no means of these the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Now, I've often heard this could be referring to evolution, the theory of evolution. They deliberately overlook the fact that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and through the water by the word, and that by the means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Evolutionists deny the flood, the global flood. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians try to localize the flood now, and they deny it too. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. So, just like in the days of Noah, Jesus talked about the days of Noah, where they were just kind of like saying nothing's going to happen, and then suddenly it came upon them. And there's going to be a destruction of fire in the future. And I would say that there's two fires that come down from heaven, one before the millennium, one after the millennium. We can look at that later. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. That phrase is used also in 2 Thessalonians. And then the heavens will pass away with a roar. Now, this could be, one of those where they say, see, this proves that the coming of Christ is after the millennium, because then it says the heavens pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. On the other hand, the Lord could be referring to the Father coming down at the end of the millennium as well. But even Jesus talked about heaven and earth will pass away in the context of Matthew 24 and and that stuff. So, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And we know that that takes place after the millennium. So I think even Post and Amil could believe that 2 Peter 3 could be talking about the future after the millennium there. Let's see, did I have anything else? I believe that is, Matthew 16. I wanted to look at this one for some reason. Where did I have that? I thought I had it. Is that it? Okay. Matthew 16:24 through 28. I want to look at this one too. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done, which sounds like the final judgment to me. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, this is a tough verse because it seems to be saying some standing here will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So for the post and amill or the preterists, they would say that that means that Jesus came in his kingdom in the first century, and that they would see him coming in his kingdom. And it seems odd. The reason it seems odd to me is because, well, first of all, I don't know what that would mean. I think that it could be understood that John, the prophet or the apostle John, saw the vision of the second coming in a vision, and other prophets may have as well. So you could look at it that way. Or because verse 27 seems to be talking about the final judgment, but then it's followed by this generation shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And I think this is the passage that the pre-mill preterists that believed this was in the first century, but that Jesus literally returned, they're taking that passage by faith, and to say that it's just all forgotten and that the resurrected saints in Christ are somewhere, but we don't see them right now. They're somewhere hidden, and I've heard theories on that, but that is an interesting passage. And I would say that to me is the one in Matthew 24, this generation shall not come to pass till all these things take place, is easier to explain because it could be saying the generation that sees all those things shall not come to pass. This one says, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not, some standing here. So he's definitely talking about that crowd, will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And that part could be understood as the judgment on Jerusalem. So a spiritual coming and not necessarily a physical return. On the other hand, the previous verse seems to be saying each person will be paid according to what he has done, which is after the millennium. So I honestly am just a little confused about this, regardless of which perspective you take. But anyway, that we will end this video here. That is a kind of a look at the signs of, you could look at it either way. Some of these might be signs of the after the millennium or before the millennium. I'm not really sure, but to me, certain things like when it says knowledge will increase, people will go to and fro throughout the earth. When Jesus said the gospel will reach every tribe, tongue, and nations to the end of the earth, that is something that hasn't been fulfilled until recently, unless you're talking about just the Roman Empire. And so some things like that seem to tell me, and on top of that, there's going to be some conspiracies that are true, global conspiracies that are happening and have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years that cause me to lean towards a futurist perspective. But again, reading a lot of these passages, I'm not sure. Like I'm open, I'm kind of like, in some sense, theologically 50-50 on this, that I could see a first century fulfillment of a lot of these things as well. So that's kind of a long drawn out video, but I'll just leave it with that. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.